And it sounds like it's a fancy word, right? But variate just means variables, okay? And so bi means two, multivariate means more than two. Okay, so instead of trying to explain our phenomenon, our dependent variable, using one variable, we're going to use several independent variables. And the elaboration model, you know, if our slides will change, the elaboration model allows us to explain the relationship between two variables by controlling for the effects of a third variable. So ideally, if you're putting together models, and we didn't really look at models in statistics, right? We're looking at something where we think several variables play a role. We want to be able to include anything that we think might be playing a role, okay? So, Chapter 1 discussed some studies on morale in the military, and morale seemed to be positively correlated to combat effectiveness. So that led people to believe that if we can improve morale, the war effort would be more successful. So Stouffer et al. Sought to confirm some commonly accepted propositions about this. So, number one, promotions should affect soldiers' morale, right? If we're getting promoted, generally we feel good about our job. So they thought soldiers that were serving in units that had low promotion rates should have relatively low morale. Given that there was racial segregation and discrimination in the South, they thought that black soldiers being trained in northern training camps should have higher morale than those being trained in the South. And soldiers with more education should be more likely to resent being drafted than those who have less education. But none of these things were true. Why? So one thing that you will learn if you get into doing research is that you're usually going to be asked to try to explain your results. And so here, the mechanism at play is reference groups and relative deprivation. So people are not evaluating themselves based on like all soldiers, right? We're not evaluating ourselves on like objective standards usually, but on the basis of our position relative to people around us. We compare ourselves with reference groups. And so people felt relative deprivation if they didn't compare favorably with their reference group. Now, the central logic of the elaboration model begins with an observed relationship between two variables, and then we want to think about, is there another variable that might actually be causing the relationship? So in Stouffer's research, the two initial variables are education level and acceptance of being drafted as fair, right? So that was like their third hypothesis. So here, it should be that your education is your independent variable, and being accepting of being drafted was your dependent variable. But another variable was actually at play, whether or not your friends were drafted. So soldiers with more education would be more accepting of being drafted because it's likely that their friends would also have been drafted, right? So it seems fair to you if other people you know are being drafted. And if other people you know are not being drafted, then it's going to fail unfair. Those with the least education were likely to have been in occupations that often got deferments from the draft, leading those drafted to feel as though they've been treated unfairly. Soldiers with low education were more likely to have friends who were deferred than soldiers with more education, and having friends who were deferred made a soldier more likely to think he should have been deferred. So as education level increased, acceptance of one's own induction also increased. Okay? So the nature of this empirical relationship was interpreted through the introduction of the third variable. This is why, when I've said to you guys before, that it's important to have expertise in the field in which you're doing your research, because you have to know, what does the literature tell us, okay? What might be playing a role here? And so when a group like economists decides to look at the death penalty and whether or not the death penalty works, they don't have the appropriate education, background, and knowledge to be thinking about whether or not their models are correct. So here, this third variable, deferment of friends, it doesn't negate the original relationship, it's there, but it's clarifying what is really happening in that relationship. So remember I said to you guys in statistics that rates of drowning and rates of eating ice cream cones, right, or ice cream, are correlated, okay? So when drownings increase, eating ice cream increases. Okay? It's pretty obvious for us to look at that and be like, well, one can't be causing the other, right? But sometimes that's not clear, because sometimes the two variables that are related seem like they should be related. We know from discussing this drowning and ice cream relationship that what's really at play, both of these things increase in the summer when there's warm weather. So to start with, we have to know if our test variable occurs before or if it intervenes. So does it occur between? Okay. So the logic hint there in this multivariate relationship is that our independent variable, education, affects the intervening test variable, having friends who are deferred or not, and that in turn affects the dependent variable. Okay, so in this case, it's an intervening variable. It's occurring between. If the test variable is an antecedent, okay, then the independent and dependent variables are empirically related to each other, but there's no causal link. They're related because they're both related to this other relationship, this other variable. Now, when this partial relationship are essentially the same as the original relationship, we can say that replication has occurred, right? That the original relationship has been replicated under test conditions. So this elaboration model is used routinely in the hope of replicating findings among subsets of a sample. So say we discover a relationship between education and prejudice. We might start introducing other variables to make sure it's not something else at play. Is it really about age? Is it really about where you live in the country? Race, religion, right? This helps us test whether or not that original relationship is true. So a term used to explain a spurious relationship. A spurious relationship is an original relationship shown to be false through the introduction of the test variable, okay? So the relationship between ice cream sales and drowning rates is spurious, okay? It's false, it's not real. They're related, but they're both related to the same variable, which is summer, okay? So in order to be able to say we have an explanation, we need the test variable has to be antecedent to both the independent and dependent variables, and the partial relationships have to be 0 or significantly less than those found in the original relationship. So when it's an intervening variable, when the variable comes in between the independent variable and the dependent variable, okay, that means there's a spurious relationship there. So Babby found a relationship between region of the country in which med school faculty attended medical school and their attitudes towards Medicare. So among those attending Eastern schools, 78% said they approved of Medicare. Amongst those attending Southern medical schools, only 59% did. Now this made sense in light of the fact that the South seemed more resistant to these programs than the East did, and presumably where we get our education, right, would impact us. Now they introduced an antecedent variable, the region of the country in which the faculty member was raised. And when you introduce this, the region of the medical school training has little to no effect. Now, interpretation is similar to explanation, except for the time placement of the test variable and the implications that follow from that. So interpretation represents the research outcome in which a test or control variable is discovered to be a mediating factor, right? Mediating meaning an intervening variable. Researchers observe that children from broken homes are more likely to become delinquent than those from intact homes, okay? Is it then something about divorce or never being married that causes your children to be more delinquent? No, supervision is the variable that is actually intervening, okay? Sometimes the elaboration model shows some partial relationships that are different. Some might be stronger than others, right? So this process is called specification. You guys might have read some journal articles that are very specific about the circumstances under which a result occurs, right? So Glock and colleagues did a study in 1967. They looked at Episcopal church members And they found that involvement decreased as social class increased. So as they became higher social class, they were less involved in the church. So church involvement provides an alternative form of gratification for people who maybe are not like feeling success or gratification in the larger society. This helped to explain why women were more religious than men, why old people were more religious than young people, because those people had less social capital, and therefore a place that they could gain that was through the church. So Glock reasoned that people of lower social class had fewer chances to gain self-esteem in secular society. Now, if social class were related to church involvement only by virtue of the fact that lower class women would be denied opportunities for gratification in secular society, the original relationship should disappear amongst women who are getting gratification. Social class should be unrelated to church involvement amongst women who held an office position. Among women who have held office in secular organizations, there is essentially no relationship between social class and church involvement. So Glock has specified conditions under which the original relationship holds. So a lot of research in social sciences, because we are dealing with people and people are unique, is going to have specifications. It's going to hold under certain circumstances. There's very few things that sort of hold generally across the board. One fact that has been found consistently for decades in criminology is that men commit the overwhelming majority of crime. They're responsible for 75% of crime. Women are responsible for 25% of crime. There was a theory that that would change as women gained more equality and access to the workplace, and it did not. So our basic paradigm, right, thought process we're operating under here is there's a relationship between two variables, okay? Rosenberg suggests we can do this even in cases where there's no original relationship, right? So we could say maybe we want to study union membership and attitudes towards having Jewish folks in the union staff, okay? So analysis indicated there was no relationship between length of union membership and these attitudes. People who belonged to the union for less than 4 years were just as willing, like had the same attitudes as people who belonged for more than 4 years. What was really playing a role here was not how long they'd been in the union, but how old the union members were. Younger members were more favorable towards Jewish folks than older members were. And then within specific age groups, those in the union the longest were most supportive. So age is acting as a suppressor variable, right? It's concealing the relationship between the length of membership and attitudes. This is again why it's really important that you do that literature review and you look at what do we already know, so that you know what variables to include in your models. So the basic paradigm focuses on those partial relationships being the same as or weaker than the original relationships. But it doesn't give us any guidelines for specifying when is that relationship significant, okay? So the limitations of this paradigm to partials that are the same or weaker neglects two other possibilities. Maybe the partial relationship is stronger. Maybe it's the opposite of the original relationship. So looking at the starting salaries of men and women in the same organization, DeServe found that women had higher starting salaries. There was a distorter variable here playing a role though. It had to do with the time at first hire, okay? When they were first hired was impacting what their starting salaries were. We also want to think about ex post facto hypotheses. Ex post facto just means after the fact. So an ex post facto hypothesis is a hypothesis created after confirming data has already been collected. You need to start your research with your hypothesis and then reject or retain it, because an ex post facto hypothesis cannot be disconfirmed.